On the evening of February 12, 2009, a Bombardier turboprop operated by Colgan Air lost control on approach and plunged into a neighborhood near Buffalo, New York, killing all 49 people on board and 1 on the ground. The disaster would shine an unflattering light on the aviation industry and lead to significant changes, especially at the small regional airlines. Founded in 1965, Colgan Air began operating scheduled passenger flights in the early 1980s. They, like other so-called regional airlines, entered into contracts with major carriers such as Pan Am, United, and American Airlines, operating routes no longer deemed profitable by operating under their name. One carrier consistently used was Continental Airlines, a partnership that allowed the company to operate under the brand name Continental Connection. By 2007, Colgan Air held agreements with several carriers simultaneously. By January of 2008, Colgan Air had acquired no less than 15 Bombardier twin turboprop regional airliners, each of which could carry up to 74 passengers. Such an expansion required the airline to hire approximately 200 new pilots in less than a year, while establishing an entirely new operating base at Newark International Airport in New Jersey. Among the pilots assigned to the new Q400 fleet was 47-year-old Captain Marvin Renslow, who had been flying Colgan planes for several years before completing training on the much larger Bombardier in December of 2008. Meanwhile, one of the numerous new pilots hired to fly the Q400 was 24-year-old First Officer Rebecca Shaw. She had worked as a flight instructor in Arizona, and this was her first job with an airline. On February 12, 2009, Captain Renslow and First Officer Shaw were assigned together to fly a series of Q400 flights in and out of Newark, which is where the story of the coming disaster begins. Although Colgan Air, like any airline, preferred that its Newark-based pilots live in the city, neither member of the flight crew did. Captain Renslow lived with his wife and kids near Tampa, Florida, while Rebecca Shaw lived even further away in Seattle, Washington. While Captain Renslow happened to be in Newark the day before the scheduled flight, First Officer Shaw was not. She boarded 2 flights and arrived at Newark just after 6 a.m. the morning of the disaster. It is now after nightfall on February 12, 2009. After a number of delays, the plane finally receives permission to taxi at 8:30 p.m., with 20 planes ahead of them in line. It wasn't until 9:18 p.m. when the flight was cleared for takeoff, and within 30 seconds they were in the air, over 2 hours behind schedule. As they climbed, Captain Renslow noticed the route to Buffalo would be in clouds where ice accumulation was forecast. In order to reduce the danger of any ice buildup, the crew activated all the de-icing equipment. Additionally, as per the Q400 flight manual, the captain is thought to have made one other minor but hugely consequential adjustment. He flipped the reference speed switch from off to increase. The accumulation of ice on the aircraft can increase drag and interrupt the smooth airflow over the wings, which raises the risk of a stall. Normally, an airplane will stall at a predictable angle of attack. However, the presence of ice can cause a stall to occur at a higher airspeed, before the stall warning should go off. Adjusting this switch should prevent the surprise stall from occurring. By 10 p.m., Flight 3407 had received permission to begin descending and was on its way down to 6,000 feet. By this time, both pilots noticed ice accumulating on the windshield. First Officer Shaw asked, "Is that ice on our windshield?" "I got it on my side," Renslow said. "You don't have yours?" "Oh yeah, it's lots of ice," Shaw said. "That's the most ice I've seen on the leading edges in a long time," Renslow commented. "In a while, anyway, I should say." "I've never seen icing conditions," Shaw continued. "I've never de-iced. I've never seen any." By the time it reached 2,300 feet, Flight 3407 was traveling at 180 knots, which was uncomfortably fast. Captain Renslow reduced power to compensate, ordered the landing gear down, and the flaps to 15 degrees, greatly increasing drag. These adjustments caused the plane to slow rapidly, its airspeed plunging towards the stick shaker activation threshold. For some reason, the captain was not paying attention to the plane's airspeed. Just after 10:16 p.m., the stick shaker activated, rattling the pilot's control columns to warn them of an impending stall, and the autopilot disconnected with a sudden alarm. In fact, the plane was not in imminent danger of stalling. The early activation of the warning was simply caused by the position of the ref speed switch set earlier. But the unexpected warning caught both pilots completely off guard, and their reaction was characterized by chaos and panic. Less than 1 second after the start of the warning, the captain grabbed his control column and hauled back to raise the nose, the exact opposite of the correct stick shaker response. The plane soon stalled, then suddenly banked 45 degrees to the left. Stall and autopilot disconnect warnings repeated throughout the cockpit as the plane started to descend. Plunging from the sky in a state of panic, the crew's irrational actions continued. First Officer Shaw moved the flap lever back to 0 degrees and announced, "I put the flaps up," a move inconsistent with the stall recovery procedure, and made the situation even worse by decreasing the available lift. Within seconds, the plane was descending almost vertically towards a quiet residential neighborhood in the Buffalo suburb of Clarence Center. "We're down," Renslow exclaimed, realizing that impact was imminent. The cockpit voice recorder picked up the sound of a thump as the plane clipped some trees. A split second later, Flight 3407 plowed directly into a house at 6038 Long Street in Clarence Center, and the recording came to an abrupt and disturbing end. Remarkably, 2 of the 3 occupants of the house survived the impact. The passengers and crew on board the plane were not so lucky. By the time firefighters arrived on scene, a huge fire had consumed both 6038 Long Street and the airplane, except for its tail section. It was obvious that none of the 49 people on board could possibly have survived. With 50 people dead, the crash was the deadliest in the United States since 2001. Despite early speculation that ice had caused the crash, the National Transportation Safety Board determined that the plane was controllable throughout the flight. In fact, a detailed reconstruction showed that the plane met or exceeded its expected performance at all times, and the plane's anti-icing systems kept critical surfaces sufficiently clean. Instead, it appeared that Captain Renslow reacted to the unexpected stall warning by pulling the nose up until the plane actually stalled, then held his controls in the nose-up position, prolonging the stall until they hit the ground. Such incompetence left investigators scratching their heads. To look for answers, the NTSB looked over his flight history. In 1991, he was disapproved for his instrument flight rating after falling short in 6 different areas, and he required additional instruction before passing on the second attempt. In 2002, he failed his single-engine land certificate due to insufficient performance in takeoffs, landings, go-arounds, and performance maneuvers, but again, he passed on a second attempt. And in 2004, he failed again, this time a commercial multi-engine land certificate due to insufficient performance in all areas, only to pass, as always, on the second attempt. The NTSB was concerned to discover that when Renslow applied to join Colgan Air in 2004, he disclosed only his 1991 failure, and not the other 2, an act that would have been a fireable offence if Colgan Air ever found out. The NTSB noted that after the initial stall, it was not too late to recover with prompt intervention by the first officer. Unfortunately, this was not done, and in fact, First Officer Shaw's actions actively made the situation worse. When Captain Renslow failed to call for the stall recovery procedures, she did not attempt to remind him. She raised the flaps without prompting, worsening the stall, and she raised the landing gear before performing higher priority steps, like reducing the angle of attack. It appears she was simply caught off guard both by the stall warning and by Renslow's inappropriate reaction. And it didn't seem that she ever fully understood what was happening. Another key component of the accident, and perhaps even the most important one, was undoubtedly fatigue. The crash happened at 10:16 p.m., which was Captain Renslow's normal bedtime. By that time, he had also been awake for at least 15 hours, which is around the time most people's ability to focus starts to drop off. He had spent the previous night on a couch in the crew room, which was not an environment conducive to restorative sleep. Similarly, First Officer Shaw slept in at least 3 distinct segments, of which 2 were on board cargo planes flying cross-country from Seattle, and the third was also in the crew room during daylight hours. Both pilots, as a result, probably received very low-quality sleep, and were probably tired throughout the trip to Buffalo. To make matters worse, most Colgan Air pilots could not afford to live in Newark, and because Colgan Air was not responsible for accommodating pilots at their home base, pilots were still expected to find overnight lodgings at their own expense. Over the course of a year, these hotel costs alone would add up and cause severe financial hardship. In summary, the findings were damning. A captain with 5 failed tests, poor and inadequate training, and a work and living environment that made fatigue unavoidable. Under the circumstance, a crash like this was bound to happen, sooner or later. In the end, sweeping changes were made to the industry. Due to no fewer than 25 NTSB recommendations, in August 2010, Congress passed the Airline Safety and Federal Aviation Administration Extension Act, mandating a comprehensive list of improvements that would include the FAA creating a single, searchable pilot records database that will allow airlines to quickly discover an applicant's past employers, training records, and disciplinary history. Separately, Colgan Air made numerous changes to procedures, training programs, and policies, but was ultimately merged into Pinnacle Airlines in 2012.